Good afternoon and welcome to our program on wildfire training for rural fire departments. We're going to be exploring wildfires from the scope of the problem through a new training initiative and ways to manage these kinds of fires through 5 panel discussions. Our first panel is going to be addressing the scope of the problem itself. And our members include Billy Terry, who is Northeastern Area Assistant Director of Cooperative Fire Management for the USDA Forest Service. Billy also serves as the chair of the NFPA Wildland Fire Management Section. His experience includes a Washington Post as former branch chief of wildfire training for USDA's Forest Service and section head for wildland fire training with the Texas Forest Service. Joining us also is Don Artley, who is the fire director for the National Association of State Foresters. His 35 years of wildland fire experience include tenure as the former state forester of Montana and former chair of the National Wildfire Coordination Group. Don currently is a member of the NIFC's National Multi-Agency Coordination Group, as well as the National Fire and Aviation Executive Board. Sean Stokes joins us. Sean is the Wildland Fire Program Manager for the International Association of Fire Chiefs. Sean is responsible for the coordination and implementation of the IAFC's wildland fire programs at the national level. And incidentally, Sean also is a volunteer fire chief, and he's a medic at the Dunloring, Virginia Volunteer Fire Department, where he is responsible for training and apparatus. Our first speaker this afternoon and the fourth member of our first panel is Charlie Dickinson. Charlie is Deputy Administrator and Acting Administrator for the United States Fire Administration, where he manages day-to-day operation of the USFA's National Emergency Training Center and oversees all projects and programs. Charlie has 44 years of fire service experience, including assignments as Fire Chief of the Pittsburgh Fire Department and Emergency Services Coordinator in Hayward, California. And with that introduction, Charlie, I'm going to ask you to put 2 hats on here to open the program. I'd like you to put your Fire Chief's hat on, and I'd like you to put your Fire Administrator's hat on, because I'm going to combine some words together. Wildland fire, wildland interface fire, and firefighter. When we put those together, what does that bring to mind for you?
Well, collectively, it describes a significant issue faced by America's fire service across the country. Individually, what it really describes is 3 different areas of interest. Let me get the fire chief's hat on first. The rules have changed. Today's fire service, and particularly in the suburban and rural parts of our country, the urban interface, we call it the wildland interface, has now become a part of protection's responsibility, meaning that fire departments that before used to just to protect the forest now is responsible for people who live in the forest. Number 2 is the fire chief. What that also requires is understanding the capability and training capacity and ability of your own individual fire department. And then lastly, and maybe the most important, is collectively what can we do as not only as a single source, because when we watch these fires occur, rarely is the single fire department able to handle those on their own, simply because it's always about the same thing. It's about time, and it's about the ability to suppress and to keep fires away from the occupied part of the forest. So there we have a problem. We have a huge problem, and it's about being interactive, training together, preparing for when that scenario begins, because time is precious. The planning capability and timing is over with. It's time to go to work, and we know how fast those incidents travel. So it's about combining all those and looking on how. This isn't about enhancing the federal fire service. It's not about enhancing the volunteer fire service. It's about how enhancing ourselves collectively together so we can help one another.
So this really is a problem at all levels?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, Billy, I want to come to you because this is a big problem, isn't it?
It's a very big problem. And all you have to do is turn on the TV, obviously, and watch the news, particularly during fire season, and you'll see homes burning up and firefighters on the ground, and you'll see firefighters from everywhere all working together. Every year, the federal wildland fire agencies for the last several years have managed to have to spend over $1 billion or more just on suppression cost. If you count the cost of all the other agencies involved, it just goes through the roof. I guess the big point is that people want to live in these areas now. And there's more people out there today than there were 10 years ago. And 10 years from now, exponentially, there'll be twice as many as there are today. That means that the agencies are going to have to be able to protect the people. Will property burn? Probably. You know, will people be evacuated inconvenienced? Probably. But we can bring people back safely, and we can have our firefighters do the job safely, and they can go home at night. That's what we're really looking for. There's no one agency that can do that alone, and what this is about is bringing all these different agencies together so they can work together efficiently, but it starts locally. It starts right there in that community and with that local fire agency.
Sounds like we really need a coordinated team effort here.
Absolutely.
Don, you know, we're talking about how complex this has gotten, but there's also still some pretty basic risks that have been around for quite a while, aren't there?
Yes, there are, Ken, and you know, and Billy's given us a nice kind of capsule of the national picture, and I think so far this year we've had over 84,000 fires nationally, and we've burned over 9 million acres, which is a record already for this year. But it's kind of hard for people, I think, the people of this country to grasp those kinds of numbers. They're sort of without a context. So I think if we try to bring it locally, we can maybe see what these impacts might look like. And for example, the state of Texas this year, they have had an extraordinary fire season for them. They've had over 24,700 individual fires since December 1st. And what's remarkable about that and scary about that is 85% of those fires started within 2 miles of a community. And I think there may be a perception there's kind of wide open spaces in Texas, so maybe this isn't a big deal. Let me tell you, the folks in Texas say this is a big deal. They burned 734 homes, primary residences, and another 1,328 outbuildings and other structures, and tragically, 19 fatalities resulted from these fires. That's just Texas. You go north to Oklahoma, they've got a similar situation. You talk to the folks in Florida, the same thing. Minnesota, many states in the West. This has been a very long and severe fire season, and the trend, frankly, Ken, is getting worse.
Okay, so we have a lot of fires. It's getting worse. We're losing homes. We're losing a lot of property. We're spending money to put the fires out. And so, Sean, I have to come to you and say, a lot of these fire departments are rural, and they're volunteer, and it's going to be really complex for the chief, isn't it?
It is going to be very complex. It's a issue where you're dealing with smaller fire departments. This takes a lot of resource to make sure that your staff is properly trained to be able to efficiently and, most importantly, safely be able to deal with the fires. It puts fire chiefs in contact with other agencies, state and federal, that maybe they weren't used to working with, and it sets the requirement that they need to sit down and meet with them, have agreements, and have an understanding of how they're going to operate together once the event happens. So it's added a whole level of complexity onto the fire chief's job, just as the chief mentioned at the outset of the program.
And we're not waiting till the first spark goes off here, right?
No, absolutely not.
Because once it goes off, it's going.
Too late.
It's too late. Well, we're going to be summarizing this panel discussion for you for the next couple of minutes, and you'll have an opportunity to look at some of the statistics and points that our panel members have made. When we come back, we're going to be looking at the skills firefighters and chiefs have to address wildland fire issues. So let's take a look at our summary, and then we'll come back for our next panel. In 2000, there were 93,250 fires nationally, which burned about 7.38 million acres. Over the next succeeding years, the trend was downward in the number of fires, but you'll notice that on the right side, the number of acres burned continued to increase. And this year, through September, there have already been 84,000 plus fires burning 9.32 plus million acres. Now, who's fighting these fires? About 16,000 federal wildland firefighters, approximately 685,000 rural and volunteer firefighters. And to date this year, the federal government has spent more than $1.4 billion fighting wildland fires. 2% of federal fires equal 98% of the acres burned. and they expend about 85% of the suppression costs. Now, there have been structural losses up through September 28, 2006. So far this year, there have been 677 primary buildings lost, 57 commercial buildings, and over 1,400 outbuildings. The federal jurisdictions versus non-federal jurisdictions, as reported through August of this year, indicate that about 17,000 plus of these fires occurred on federal lands, while 61,000 plus fires occurred on non-federal lands. In Texas this year, 19 lives have been lost since December 1st because of wildland fires. Now, 2 of those were firefighters who were killed in vehicle accidents en route to the fires, and the fire departments so far this year in Texas, since December, have responded to more than 24,000 wildland fires. 85% of all wildland fires in Texas were within 2 miles of a community. So far, 734 homes have been lost, along with more than 1,300 outbuildings. State assistance was required for 15% of the fires that burned 70% of the acreage. Welcome back. Earlier we were talking about the size of the wildland fire problem, and now we're going to look at how we address that problem. And we have some new panelists joining us. Mike Doherty is the Fire Program Specialist for the U.S. Fire Administration's Wildland Fire Operations. For 32 of his 38 years of experience in fire service management, Mike served the USDA Forest Service in positions ranging from smoke jumper to Assistant Director of Fire Operations. Mike also serves as the Chief of Fire and Rescue for the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. Kelly Hawk also is joining us. She is the Community Protection Specialist for the Bureau of Land Management and NIFC, and chair of the Advancing Wildland Fire Training for Fire Departments Task Group. She has 19 years experience in federal wildland fire and natural resource management, and has also served as a city fire inspector, park ranger, and EMT. Paul Hanneman is the Chief Regional Fire Coordinator for the Texas Fire Service, which is responsible for wildland fire protection for over 220,000 square miles. Paul coordinates emergency response training for the Texas Forest Service and has 30 years experience of structural and wildland fire to his credit. And Paul's also incident commander for the Lone Star State Incident Management Team. And Don Artley is also back with us. So Don, welcome back.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay, well, we talked about how big the fire is. Now we have to talk about how we're going to put it out. Kelly, you've had extensive experience with this, and I have to ask you, if you're going to go in and fight wildland fires, what do you have to know? What do you have to be able to do?
Well, certainly scene size up is an important skill coming into a wildland fire. You have to understand what you're looking at, what your contingencies are going to be, what kind of resources do you have to draw upon, what are the skills and abilities of the people that you're working with, and what sorts of skills and abilities are you going to need to handle the incident effectively and safely.
So there is a set of skills that you have to have here to do this. Now, Mike, you've also had extensive experience and been out on the fire line. What are some of the real practical pieces of skill and knowledge that you have to be successful in these arenas that Kelly's named?
Well, I think to begin with, as she mentioned, you're going to have to be able to size up the situation, know what you're going into, understand the problems at hand, understand the environment you're working in. What is the fuel conditions? What are your issues as it relates to the urban interface? What are your values at risk? And formulate a plan. What kind of mutual aid equipment are you going to be able to have come to assist you? Or is it a single jurisdiction, a multiple jurisdiction incident? And what are your cooperators' capabilities? So you need to bring all that stuff together and be able to perform those actions in a safe and effective manner, as Kelly mentioned.
So we have to keep working on those skills. And Don, I think that goes back to how do you acquire those and how do you practice them?
Well, Ken, it's you acquire them locally through your own training organization from whatever organization you work for. And I think one of the keys to what we're trying to do here with with this initiative is trying to make sure that that training is consistent. We're training to the same goals, and that so when a firefighter arrives at an incident, we can be confident that they can perform the job to which they are assigned, whether they come from a rural fire department, from a state fire agency, or perhaps from a federal agency.
I want to go to you, Paul, because I think we've talked a little bit about Texas issue, and you've had quite a year there in Texas. From a state level, how does the coordination and cooperation work between state resources, and I guess partly what state resources are available to help out with local firefighters when they have a problem?
Well, that's a very important comment there, is what state you may be in, because it differs throughout the nation as to what resources may be available out there. We think it's very important that, you know, our local fire departments are the primary provider of fire protection, and our job is, of course, is to help them when conditions get in extreme conditions and need that assistance. And that varies in that assistance. I mean, we look at building local capacity as a very important part of that, and that deals with training, that deals with equipment, then that also deals with helping coordinate when they do have a fire of mass magnitude, and if it's over and above their capabilities, is being able to bring in state and even federal resources to assist that and doing it in a very safe and consistent manner.
And we're actually bringing firefighters in now.
That's correct. Yeah, we would bring possibly firefighters, ground and aerial equipment to assist them, but the important part is, do they have the training to help in that operation? Again, keeping in mind safety is our job one.
Kelly, I want to come back to you on this because I know you've been on the fire line. You know what it's like to be out there with this. When firefighters get into wildland fire situations, and we talk about being able to size up what's going on, what are some of the things you need to be looking at while you're sizing this up? What are the clues that should be coming to you about what you ought to be doing? Well,
certainly you're going to look at your fuels, the terrain that you're in, the weather that's occurring at that time and the weather that's predicted later on, where you are in relationship to the fire, what other crews are doing, what other resources are doing, a number of things. It's a complex scenario, certainly.
It sounds to me like you have to stay very, very aware of what's going on around you, because you can get very focused on the task and lose track of what's going on.
Certainly.
Now, Mike, we had in your intro that you were a smoke jumper, and I assume maybe you were managing while you were smoke jumping, but smoke jumping is a highly skilled and technical part of this, isn't it?
Well, I think smoke jumping, that's just a vehicle to get to the incident. Just another method to get there. In that environment, I think is different than this, and generally you're dealing with remote fires and remote locations, but the same issues apply. And I think here we're talking about really more complex issues, because we're talking about multiple agencies having to work together. We're talking about the interface issues, as we said before, the structures that are at risk, what has been built up, what is the important things to your community. Is this a community that needs tourism? And what are you going to do to your tourism if you burn off the landscape? So all those issues come into bear as you're planning for this environment. And so I believe being ready in the beginning, and as we talk about the firefighting environment, some of the basic skills, lookouts, communication, safety zones, those types of issues that's what the firefighter needs to know on the ground. Then we're going to have to transition. What does management need to know? And how are they going to deal with the issues at hand? And have they talked to their counterparts previously? Do they know who they are? Have they done some pre-planning? How are they going to deal with this? You have a new subdivision in an area, and it buttons up against federal protection responsibilities. How are you going to manage that in a unified front?
Management's important, and Don, I want to come back to you on this because as a state forester, I mean, you had to have the big picture in these kinds of incidents, but the commander on the ground, he's got to manage a lot of complexity. I mean, all of our panelists have talked about how complex these issues are now.
Yes.
So how do you get command of this?
And that's probably one of the most important aspects that we have not yet talked about, and that's working under a single unified command structure. Because in rural areas, we often have, as Mike mentioned, multiple jurisdictions with responsibility for different aspects of an emergency, for example. So every incident has an incident commander that initially takes charge, and that often can be someone from a rural fire department. But as the incident grows in complexity and other agencies become involved, we need perhaps a higher level, someone with a higher level of experience to assume the command of the incident, and we have multiple jurisdictions. We'll need to have what we call unified command, because both jurisdictions have the right and the need to be there. So command structure is important, and fortunately, through the National Response Plan, now we have a national incident management system, and that we have incident command as the way that we will organize to fight incidents. So regardless of the type of emergency you respond to, the terminology is now the same, and we can integrate much more effectively.
So we have a system.
We do.
Okay. But, Paul, we've got to use the system, and I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here. Okay. You come in from the States, you get a call. I have a hard time imagining you walking into the incident commander and saying, I'm in charge now, get out of the way.
Well, absolutely not. That's not the way to do it. I appreciate you asking that question. I think it's important to understand that, as Don mentioned about, local jurisdictions, it's really their fire. And the important part for us is to understand when we come in that they have a right there and they've requested assistance, and we like to come into a fire, at least from our state level, and I know many states in the nation do the same thing, and come in and put their arm around and says, how can we help? And then we go inside, it may say it's big, it's bad, it's ugly, it's yours, but the other side of it is they may very well say, no, let's help in doing it together, and that's what ties into that unified command that Don mentioned, and that's really the way we like to do it.
Okay. So I think if we're looking at this, then, there are training pieces available to get people ready for wildland fires. And there certainly is a management system available to help manage these complex issues. Is that fair to say?
Yes, absolutely.
The last point, then, is how do we get this training? Real quickly. I mean, at this point right now, where do you get the training?
Well, basically, there's a couple ways. You can get it right here at the U.S. Fire Administration. It has many courses that will assist the rurals and the volunteers as well as the municipals. And then NWCG, National Wildfire Coordinating Group, also has many courses, and most of those courses, besides being sponsored through the federal agencies, are also sponsored through the states. And so those are two primary areas that the wildland community or anybody that needs wildland fire training can get that. Part of what our initiative is how can we do this and make it easier and more efficient for the rurals and the volunteers, and that's part of what we're here today to talk about.
And that is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to go to a summary of this panel discussion for the next couple of minutes, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some important federal initiatives to help that training reach local levels more efficiently. Let's take a look at our summary, and then we'll come back to our next panel. 84% of local fire departments provide wildland fire protection. In communities with a population under 2,500, that number rises to 90%. An effective command structure is critical for incident success. The National Incident Management System, Incident Command System, provide the necessary structure for incident success, and training is readily available for that through both the United States Fire Administration and the National Wildland Coordinating Group. There are similarities between wildland and structural incidents. It is critical to accurately size up these wildland incidents, and you must provide for the safety of the responders and prepare for contingencies. It's important that firefighters use wildland fire personal protective equipment, including the fire shelter, because this was designed specifically for safe, effective work on wildland fires. Lookouts, communications, escape routes, safety zones, LCES, very important safety considerations in a wildland fire. It's also important to get to know the 10 standard fire orders and the 18 watch-out situations. Also, firefighters need to be able to recognize and understand current and potential wildfire behavior. Now, fire science is the same for structural and wildland disciplines. But fire behavior is different in wildland fires based on the environment. That includes the fuels, weather, and the topography. Both of these come together in the wildland-urban interface incident. Tools and techniques are different for wildland fires. You often have to work away from the apparatus, and water, if any, is used differently. It is important to understand differences between offensive and defensive tactics. Those are direct versus indirect attacks in wildland fire incidents. More than half of the nation's firefighters receive no formal wildland fire training. And welcome back again. We have talked about the size of the wildland fire problem. It's growing, it's getting bigger, it's getting more complex. We have talked about the need for more resources and better coordination of resources. And we've talked about the fact that fires are local, and that's where it's going to start, and that's the initial response. And our panelists now are going to look at this issue as we talk about how are we going to do a better job of having training for local level wildland firefighting. And we've got some reports, and Don, I think we're going to go to you next because it really started with a report to Congress, didn't it?
Well, it really did, Ken, and actually the impetus for that came from my home state of Montana, and that was the fire season of 2000, which may arguably perhaps one of the worst, most severe wildland fire seasons we've seen in this country for many, many years. And out of that came deep concern by the President at the time and Congress, and resulted in something we loosely call National Fire Plan. But out of that came an action item or a task, and that was to assess the capabilities and needs of rural fire departments, particularly the volunteers working in the interface, and make a report to Congress. So along with, in fact, all of the current panelists, we had a task force. We wrote that report. We used a survey done by the U.S. Fire Administration in conjunction with the NFPA, and compared it to a survey done 10 years prior to that, and discovered a lot of information that caused us some concern. We'd found that not much had changed over 10 years, frankly. And as we looked at the key issues, one of those key issues was training. And like we said in the last panel, over half of the rural fire department volunteers had received no training in wildland firefighting. So training became the key issue, and that then was the trigger that led to these other reports.
So that's the beginning, and we find that we need more training. It needs to be more accessible. And Kelly, then your report came into the picture.
That's right. A number of issues were brought up in the first report. Training was certainly a prominent issue brought up, and there was a number of implementation tasks that were brought forward that were suggested in the report. I was asked to chair an interagency group to put together the how-tos of the implementation, how to achieve these goals. And generally, kind of the basis of this is that, as Don mentioned, over half the rural fire departments, volunteer fire departments, don't have wildland fire training, yet they do respond to wildland fires on a regular basis, particularly in small rural communities. The problem is that the traditional training is difficult for them to get. It's not readily accessible because often rural and volunteer firefighters, they can't leave for a week or for 2 weeks to come to the fire academy or to go to a traditional 40-hour NWCG course. What's more is rural and volunteer firefighters often have skills that they've gained through their structural training. We thought, how can we leverage those existing skills, package training that can be taken in convenient blocks, 3-hour blocks like on drill nights, combined with important field-level exercises and drills, so that they're able to get that essential training that they need to be safe, to be effective, and yet, you know, efficiently use that training time that they have. It's at a premium. They have a lot of other required training that they need to do every year to carry out their duties, EMS, rescue, structural fire. They're responsible for a lot within their communities, but their training time is at a premium, and we need to make the best use of that.
So we go from the report to Congress that identifies a great many issues. With Kelly, we go to the report your group worked on that identified training and how are we going to make this training work. And now we come over to Mike to the crosswalk project, where I guess you could say the rubber really meets the road here, because now we're getting down to the training issues, aren't we?
Well, I think we are. In the crosswalk project, the National Wildfire Coordinating Group tasked the U.S. Fire Administration to look at fire training, wildland fire training that was done by the states and locals, and see if there's anything out there that could be crosswalks, so to say, to what NWCG is providing. Interesting enough, what we found out was, for the most part, states are using NWCG training, and there isn't any other specific training courses out there that are being used. They modify it slightly for their local conditions. So that was an interesting thing to find out, and it was probably a good thing to find out. But what we've, as Kelly mentioned, what we want to do is try to look at the training the structure fire community has been receiving, and what training similar, essentially the same, that within the wildland fire community, and figure out what the gaps are. And that is what we've been doing with this training. We've been looking, basically we've used NFPA standards that they have, and looked at those standards as it relates to NWCG coursework. And where are the gaps? That if a fire department is receiving this level of training to meet those standards, what are the gaps to be a strong wildland fire person? And I think we said it earlier, we're really not targeting this for this person to be someone that's going to travel across the country and do this. We're targeting this at the local level. We want to make them a better wildland firefighter for their local unit and their local needs. And so that's kind of what the crosswalk is about.
So we now have a document or several documents that have led us to the point where we can begin addressing local level response, skilled local level response, that not only effectively addresses the fire, but brings firefighters home safely in one piece, trying to get that to the local folks in a way that meets their time needs and their available resources. Now, Billy, I got to come to you because Mike mentioned the standards word and certification, and we probably need to address this now. Okay. And I think NFPA is probably the place we at least sort of start the discussion. Okay. What are we talking about here? I think everybody knows the standards for the structural firefighter are. Okay.
For the NFPA, you know, 1001 and 1021 for the NFPA. There's also 1051, which is for the wildland firefighting standard of the NFPA. The one thing I probably ought to start off by saying is that what we're talking about here today is not a new standard. It's not. What we're doing is we're talking about giving you the tools to be able to train to whatever standard you've chosen to meet in your locale, or whatever it is that needs to be met in your locale. And all of this that we're planning on doing in the future is going to be an assist. It's not something new. It's not a new burden. It's going to take a burden off of you, which I think the other members of the group have said. So as far as standards go, we realize that every state is going to be a little different. Every locale is going to be a little different. You may have a standard. You may not have one. But this will give you an opportunity to choose what you want to train to and then figure out the best way to do it for your people and your particular situation.
Okay, so we have NFPA, but there's also National Wildlife Coordinating Standards, aren't there?
National Wildland Coordinating Group standards.
Right.
That's correct.
And what do they relate to?
That relates to wildland fire. Those are the recognized core standards for wildland fire in the United States. And the curriculum is really recognized as the gold standard for wildland fire. And so what we looked at, and kind of expand on Mike's point and Billy's point, we looked at the NWCG objectives out of task books, and we looked at the NFPA standards. We were able to match parallel competencies and skills within those documents, and then we were able to identify the gaps. And just to provide some examples, you're looking at overhaul and mop-up, finding hidden fire, suppressing it, extinguishing it. Same concept, a little bit different. You use similar tools, but the use is a little bit different. Water use is a little bit different. You might understand hose lays, but there's a difference between a progressive hose lay in a wildland incident and a hose lay in a structure. So there's parallel skills, but there's missing elements. So that's the work that we did to kind of get moving on the crosswalk to see where we were going as far as capitalizing on those existing skills that volunteer and rural fire departments have, so that they don't, you know, make the best use of their skills and their time.
Okay, so we're not starting from scratch here.
No.
We're not starting all over. You don't have to start back at very basic. We can take what you bring to the table. And in fact, it sounds to me like you're saying you found the structural firefighters bring things to the table.
Absolutely.
Those courses bring things to the table. So now we're looking at increasing their skills on the wildland fire, but we're not shoving any standards down anybody. This is to deal with local level response to help people become more skilled. Is that what we're looking at?
That's correct.
Okay.
You bet.
Well, we're going to summarize this by having you meet a fellow named Tim Dunkel. Tim currently serves as the Pennsylvania State Fire Academy Training Service Administrator. He is a Type 3 Incident Management Team Leader and has been an active firefighter since 1971. Tim has also served as Vice President of the North American Fire Training Directors from 2003 to 2005. I had an opportunity to sit with Tim and talk about these very issues with him. Let's take a look at what Tim had to say. Tim, on our program so far today, we've addressed the issue of what firefighters need to know to be effective in wildland fire situations and wildland-urban interface fires. And we've looked at the gaps in training between structural firefighting and wildland firefighting. So I guess the question now comes to, how do we address this through training? What will we do to address these gaps?
Well, first off, that's going to vary from state to state because no state runs the same curriculum, okay? So they're going to, each individual state's going to have to sit down and look at what's in their basic firefighter structural curriculum, look at the crosswalks that have been done and identify within their state where the gaps are. And then they're going to have to develop curriculum that'll work as a bridge curriculum that'll take your structural people and bring them over to the competencies they need for wildland firefighting. Usually those are a shorter program than the normal process of wildland versus structural, and it will pick them up where their skills leave off at the structural level and give them the extra knowledge, the extra skills that they need, and they're going to touch in subjects such as the specialized fire behavior of the fuels and stuff they'll encounter, and the terrain and topography, all of that, the different types of hand tools and methods of attack. I mean, a structural firefighter uses hoses and water to fight most fires. Wildland, it's pretty hard to stretch hoses, although they do sometimes use hose and water. It's a lot of hand work out there, so there's a whole lot of different techniques to be learned that way. But it's going to, again, it's going to vary depending on what's done. For example, in Pennsylvania, our basic firefighter curriculum teaches them how to handle grass fires, small brush fires. So we've got a part of an edge on that process of taking them to a true wildland firefighter.
Tim, it seems like this kind of training is really going to increase our need for instructors and qualified instructors. So how can you go about finding these folks?
I think the first thing is the state training people are going to have to get to know the foresters for their area, the state forester, and work with them. Again, in Pennsylvania, we have some of the people who are with forestry that are local level instructors for us that deliver the training. So we'll be able to pull them in to help us develop what's needed, the skills, and then the next step will be to go to our basic firefighter instructors and bring them in and give them train-the-trainer updates so we can hone their skills and knowledge on doing the classes, and then we offer them out to the fire service.
I guess this brings us, Tim, to the point where we need to talk about certification, because wildland firefighting does have standards that you need to meet, as does structural firefighting. So how can we bring these standards together? How do we look at the certification issue, and how do we help the rural and volunteer firefighters meet those standards and certification requirements?
Well, again, that's going to vary from state to state. Some states have mandatory or required certification. The curriculum is developed and it leads to that directly. Pennsylvania is a voluntary certification state. So what will happen is we do offer certification on a voluntary basis. We'll tie this to the programs where when a person completes their bridge training, they'll be able to set for the written exam for knowledge base, and then they'll also be able to take part in the skills tests, and that will let them then be certified to the National Pro Qual standards. We'll have to work with the Forestry Department, and we'll have to do this in all states, so that those certifications will cross over to their red card system, where they identify what the people are capable of doing and assign that to their credentials card.
It sounds like we have a solution then to this problem, but how do we implement it?
I think there's solutions out there. They're going to vary, but I think they're there. It's going to rest with state training, the Forestry Service in each state, and those two working together as a team to be able to bring the structural people up to the par that they can capably work out there on the wildland fires or the wildland-urban interface fires, doing even structural protection.
Welcome back. Tim was able to clarify many points about the training, and we're going to get into that in some detail now with our panel, and all of our panel members are back. We were talking about the issue that we're looking for ways to help with local training. And obviously, we're not going to do training in everything everywhere. It's a very complex response. So, Billy, I want to come to you because there are some parallels between the wildland fire and the NFPA designations, but there's also some differences, and I think we probably ought to clarify those.
Yeah, part of it's terminology, and let me just cut to the chase.
Go right to it.
In the wildland fire scenario, we talk about a firefighter 2. That's our very basic firefighter. They know the basics, they know how to operate the tools, and they're going out there under somebody else's leadership. A firefighter 1 will be a leader at some point, a squad leader, but they're supervising some people. Just the opposite in the structural and the NFPA standard. The 1 is the beginning firefighter, the 2 is the advanced firefighter. So that's just a nomenclature thing. I do think that probably the strongest differences there as far as just look at your basic firefighter. You take your structural firefighter and you now want to put them into a wildland fire scenario. The difference is they need to understand such things as the 10 standard fire orders. They need to understand what those are and how to use them and what are the situations that might get you in trouble, the situations that cry, watch out, because something may be fixing to happen. They also need to learn a little bit about fire behavior and that sort of thing. The advanced person or the leader out there, the boss, if you will, needs to know a little bit more about leadership and working, controlling people, some of which they may have learned in some of their structural firefighting classes, but we want to put it in a different context now of what are you going to do to protect these people that are under you. So those are the basic differences between the structural and the wildland, putting them in context. Okay.
And we now want to bring some of this together without complicating it, obviously.
Obviously.
So, Don, I'm going to come over to you. I mean, talk about these 10 orders. I'm sorry, Paul. Don's been sitting there for so long. I forgot that you morphed into Paul here, and we're glad to have you. What about these 10 orders? I mean, just let's talk about this for a couple minutes.
One of them is fight fire aggressively, provide for safety first, and it's the primary things that we actually have. These similar orders, if you will, as we know them in the structural business too, of the conditions of things by which we're going to operate safely on an incident. That's really a lot of part of what we're driving at in this training that we're talking about, is are we able to attack the fire in a safe manner, whether it's being in a structure, being in a confined space, or being out in the wildland where it's an open space situation. There are some similarities, but especially we talk about the fire science, there are similarities, but fire behavior is considerably different, and those fire orders help us in working through that factor.
So this is real practical information that we're talking about here. This is how do you get out there and do the job and come back in one piece.
Absolutely.
Mike, as part of the Crosswalk project, I think you visited some states and looked at what they were doing. I think there were 8 states involved. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What did you find?
What we found, as I said before, that was interesting is that the training that states are providing is based on NWCG coursework. And so with that in mind, and not finding specific courses that we could say are equal to or better than an NWCG course that we could say, yeah, we could certify that as meeting the NWCG standards, we came back to the notion that we're going to have to look at the standards, the training standards that a structure person is getting and the training standards that a wildland person is getting, and figure out what the gaps are. And I think that's what's going to come out as being very important within the crosswalk. The other thing within the crosswalk is that we decided that we wanted to focus on the needs at the local level, so we put parameters on it that we were going to look at firefighter 2, firefighter 1, in the wildland community, the engine boss, the individual that supervises a single engine operations, and strike team leader engine, the individual that supervises multiple engines on a scene in an operation. And we figured those are the 4 best areas that we could make the best impact on for the locals and the rurals to become better prepared in the wildland-urban interface.
Okay, Kelly, I'm coming to you on this one now. We've talked about standards. We've got them on both sides. We've talked about the fact that the skills cross over, and we're looking at 4 areas of training. So is there going to be some great organization come out of the sky to these small communities and bless your certification? Or how are we actually going to make sure that the firefighters actually do have the skills? Who does that?
Well, as Mike pointed out, there's some important sideboards here, and that we're limiting this particular alternative training to firefighter 1, firefighter 2, engine boss, and strike team engines. And there's an element of personal responsibility here, and the roles and responsibilities of the firefighter, the rural firefighter, and the authority having jurisdiction, or it could be the local fire chief, the state forester, any number of people, just depending on the jurisdiction. And they have a responsibility to document their training, to document how they crosswalk their training and their experience with the NWCG standards, and keep track of that and be able to verify, this is how I came to my decision to give this person a certification as a firefighter 2. This is how I came to my decision to decide that this person is qualified to be a single resource engine boss. So the firefighter is responsible for documenting their qualifications, and the AHJ is responsible for assessing those qualifications and training fairly, appropriately, and issuing appropriate qualifications to that person.
Aha. So it's local, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And it's the community, through the authority having jurisdiction, that's going to decide the qualifications.
That's correct.
Okay. Now that brings us to, Paul, what role does the state play in this scenario?
Well, the state becomes an advisor, and again, as I mentioned a little earlier, was the fact of developing on this local capacity building, providing that guidance, if you will, to provide for it. Tying into what Kelly mentioned about authority having jurisdiction, you know, even in the state and in the federal agencies that do this kind of training, they have it for the qualifications and certifications. They have a red card committee, for example. Well, in a local jurisdiction could have a similar thing. We'd call it a peer review board. And then the final person, of course, should be in a local fire department, that fire chief, being that person that puts the ultimate certification, says that they are qualified to do whatever these jobs are. And in regards to the state, is we've got to continue to provide some kind of guidance in how we can accomplish that. I also feel the state has an obligation to provide for this train the trainers to get these folks up to what our expectations. And they do that by many ways too. I mean, whether it's by a wildfire academy, whether it's by going out to the local fire departments and training them up to train the trainers, preferably, and then getting them up to use that for the future in their training.
This sounds pretty exciting because it means that the local folks have control over what's going on. Exactly. They can control the qualifications. They can make sure their folks are qualified. They can make sure that they know what they're doing when they go out to fight fire. Now,
there's a critical distinction here that I'd like to make.
That's where we need to go.
And we need to make sure that this is clear. NWCG recognizes the ability of local cooperators to assess and accept each other's qualifications and training for local level deployment. We need to make it very clear. This is not a system by which rural and volunteer fire departments can use a crosswalk and then suddenly be qualified to go on national deployment. If you wish to go out on national assignments through the national system, you've got to follow the NWCG task books, the 40-hour courses, you know, whatever your state determines is going to qualify you through agreement to go on national assignments. So that needs to be clear that that's what the context of this discussion.
And that's really what we're talking about here. This is not getting you the card that sends you all over the country to fight firefighters. This is preparing the capacity to get to those wildfires and deal with them effectively in your local jurisdiction.
That's correct.
And that's what we're looking at here. Okay, well, let's summarize this panel for a few minutes. And when we come back, we're going to put our panelists, all of our panelists, I wouldn't say on the hot seat, but that's really what we're going to do. We're going to put a sample community up, and we're going to see what that sample community has to do to get ready for a wildland fire. We'll be back in just a minute. Let's take a look at the summary. A 2003 report to Congress highlighted the changing role and needs of local firefighting forces with regard to wildland fire, and made recommendations to improve the force's ability to safely and effectively carry out their roles in the rapidly growing wildland-urban interface. The 2003 report recommended that we develop training packages that meet the needs of rural and volunteer firefighters, expand the use of locally based trainers, improve reciprocity between structural and wildland training standards. An implementation plan addressing the recommendations was finalized in 2006. Foundation points of that plan: National Wildland Coordinating Group 310-1 qualification standards are mandatory only for national mobilization. Cooperating agencies at the local level can jointly define each other's qualifications for initial attack, extended attack, and large fire operations. Another foundation point: the initiatives apply only to local level implementation. Authorities having jurisdiction and firefighters have the responsibility to accurately document training and experience. The United States Fire Administration's Training Equivalencies Crosswalk Project of November 2005 recommended to the NWCG State Fire Training, USFA, a standardized crosswalk of equivalent training or potential reciprocity between structural and wildland training. A key discovery of the states surveyed was that much of their basic wildland fire training is based on NWCG entry-level curriculum. More recommendations: the crosswalk identifies the competency gaps and training redundancies between the National Fire Protection Association's 10001 and 10021 and the National Wildland Coordinating Group positions of Firefighter 2 and Firefighter 1, Single Resource Engine Boss, and Strike Team Leader Engine. A fire department must be trained using a recognized standard to use crosswalk methodology. Welcome back for our final panel, and as promised, we have them all on stage, and I can say Don now, and Don will be where we thought he was going to be. And Paul, we're glad to have you back as well. We have been talking about wildland fires and wildland-urban interface fires and defining the complexity and the response issues and the command issues and the training issues, and we've come up with some, I think, really good ideas for training, things that are going to make a difference. But now I think we've got to actually put this out there and let's apply it to a small community. So let's look at a sample community. Let's say that the community has a population of 2,500. It has a small business district surrounded by historic houses. It's situated in a mountainous, wooded area that is very attractive to tourists. So they have a lot of people there, and their Chamber of Commerce is constantly doing things to bring people into the area. The community is adjacent to government lands. There is a small municipal police department and an active volunteer fire department with 25 active response members. And there's a new subdivision with 50 houses under construction at the edge of the government land. And by the way, there's poor access to the wildlands, and there's limited available water. This should sound pretty normal. And to make it a little more fun, we've got power grids that cross the government and the private land. Is this a setup for a wildland fire?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw this out to the panel. What do they have to do to be ready for this? Billy.
Well, first off, they've got to be talking before the fire starts. I mean, once the ignition is on the ground, it's too late. If you haven't talked and you haven't put together agreements and you haven't trained together, you're in trouble. The other thing is that we all need to know what each other's capabilities are, and that goes back to what we're talking about here today. So all that preliminary talking, planning, training, exercising together, all that has to be done before this happens. You know, if not, like I said, too late.
So this nice little community's got to be thinking about this while the weather is still fair and the woods are still there. Okay. What else do we have to do?
Well,
You know,
I
I
agree
think-
with Billy.
Go ahead, Shelley.
Relationships are everything, and there's a couple of aspects to that. First, it's, of course, what the cooperators can do together. You come to a wildland incident, that's not the time to, you know, start talking about qualifications or training or jurisdictions or, you know, who's going to do what, roles and responsibilities, what are the priorities here. That's not the time. Beforehand is the time. So certainly, as Billy mentioned, there's things that cooperators can do ahead of time, you know, agreements and so forth. And really just keeping tabs on one another, talking to one another, establishing that relationship. But communities can do a lot together too, and those are the citizens of the community. And they can work on FireWise plans, work with the FireWise group through NFPA, the state and federal cooperators, and take a look at the NFPA website, firewise.org. And of course, CWPPs, Community Wildfire Protection Plans. That's a way that citizens and the cooperators can get together as a community and plan for evacuations, plan for aid stations, all that kind of stuff together as a group. Instead of making it just a local government responsibility, it's a community thing now. People have ownership and they buy into it. They're involved.
So this is a community project.
Absolutely.
Mike, I got to ask you, these agreements, are we just sitting down over a cup of gourmet coffee and shaking hands, or are we going to formalize this?
No, they need to be formalized. And one other thing I wanted to say, too, is you mentioned the fact that there was a small police department here. Don't forget your law enforcement cooperators. The law enforcement folks need to be part of the group. They're going to have a role in this wildland fire if it gets out of hand, as well as the county sheriff's department. So keep your law enforcement partners in the loop as you develop this process.
What would this fire department need to do? Let's go back to the training issues that we were talking about. What is this fire department going to have to do to get their folks ready to fight this fire? Let's go back through the process we talked. What do they have to do?
I think one thing they have to do is survey where they are right now, is get the base, you know, what's their base to start out with. You know, do they need, you know, the equipment? Granted, now lots of fire departments, that's what they look a lot at, but also what's their capabilities in regards to their personnel or training, which is a big piece that we're talking about here today, and realize where are we at in that process, and do that beginning. And that ties into what everybody else has spoke about right now, again, is putting that plan together, get involved with your state fire training and your state forestry as advisors to assist you in that process, because that's what we can do, and that to me would be the most important thing.
Don, I want to come to you because we got government lands here, and let's say that they're state forestry lands.
Often the case.
What are you going to be doing here?
Well, the same thing, hopefully, that the other agencies with jurisdiction are doing, and that is prior to the fire season beginning, hopefully I've got mutual aid agreements in place. My local people with the local residents of this community or the local fire department, we have a co-op agreement with that county involved, so they know how to ask us for help if necessary. And we go back to the command structure we talked about before. When you have multiple jurisdictions involved, you can't be clumsy in trying to determine who's in charge of the fire. You can't obviously have two command posts being set up simultaneously and trying to compete to fight the fire. So that's got to be smooth. And probably the key component is always is whoever that incident commander is, or the unified incident command, they've got to be confident that all responders who show up to that incident are in fact qualified to safely do the job that they're charged with. And if that can happen, and if my agency, the federal agency, and the local fire chief can all operate effectively together, then we've got a darn good chance of suppressing that fire and minimizing the damage.
And doing it quickly at an early stage of the fire.
Absolutely.
Sean, I want to come to you because it's not just the chief and his little volunteer fire department, is it?
No, it absolutely is not. As was alluded to, it's a unified command. It takes multiple agencies. Most of the rural and volunteer departments are very small departments. They have limited resources. That's why the planning process, the process that you go into is so very critical for them, because they have limited resources. They need to know who they can call upon, who's available to be able to help them fight this fire, knowing that they're probably going to be the first group in, the first group of firefighters on the scene. And they are also the group that needs the assistance in making sure that their firefighters are properly trained to be able to safely do the job so they can come home at the end of the day.
Great points. Well, let's go around. We're going to give you a shot now to make your final points. And Billy, I'm going to start with you. Key point about this whole issue.
Just want to reiterate this, because I'm sure this will run some people off if they don't understand it, but this is not a new standard we're talking about. We're talking about giving you the tools to be able to train to whatever standards you choose or may be required in your locale, and it will help you do this efficiently on your own time within your own training program. That's all it is. We're making it easier. It's nothing new. It will make a difference in your ability to do the job. It will make a difference in reciprocity with other agencies being able to recognize your people and what their capabilities are.
Good points. Mike.
To take that one step further, they need not to do it by themselves. They need to do it with their partners, be it state partners or federal partners or other local jurisdictions. And they need to do it in an environment that everybody can be open and working together. And as we said before, you're much better off together than you are apart, and we're stronger as we are together. As we mentioned before, most of the time it's going to be that rural volunteer or volunteer fire department that's first on scene. If they could put that fire out, they've probably just saved somebody millions of dollars. And that's a significant thing in this day and age and the budgets that we're all dealing with.
Don?
Well, to continue to build on that theme a little bit, not only are we not creating a new standard, we're also not modifying or changing the existing NFPA or NWCG standards. Really what we're doing is simply identifying, as we've been talking, gaps that need to be filled and barriers that need to be removed, and particularly through the delivery of training in alternative means. You know, we've described this fire problem we have in this country, and it's growing, and it is absolutely impossible for state and federal agencies to do this job by ourselves, as it is impossible for local fire departments to manage it by themselves. You know, we need to work together, as Mike said, if we're going to be successful. And as I like to say, we can choose to be successful together, or we can risk failing separately.
Paul.
Well, I think my big message would be is the fact that we want to ensure that safety is the utmost importance throughout this whole process. And that goes with, we talk about the training. It's a matter of the folks knowing, you know, what the situation is, you know, what's the difference in that wildland versus structural, how do we accomplish in getting those, you know, competency levels up, and making sure that that goes through all of the various entities that are working out there. And again, that ties back again to our state forestry, tying into the state fire entities, and then most important down to that local fire department who's got to go out, and all of us are taking care of the same customers at the same time. So that's an important thing. Looking after safety is number one.
Kelly?
You know, I try to think of another point on the break today, but I'm with Paul. I can't seem to get off that. I'm for safety, too. I think safety is the number one consideration. During the time that we put out the report together, that was foremost in my mind. I think that rural and volunteer firefighters face enough hazards doing all their other duties, certainly, and rural and volunteer firefighters do not need to be put themselves at risk fighting wildland fires when they don't have the skills and the basic knowledge to do so. So I think that this push is just really important for safety. Even if they never go above firefighter 2 or firefighter 1, and you know, that's really more or less what I expect, is that we're just looking at a basic level of training for the most part. That's going to save some lives. That's going to keep people out of danger.
Good point. Sean?
I think the important point is we've brought up all day, the changing demographic is putting more people into the interface, and it's causing an increase in the amount of fire that the rural and volunteer departments are actually fighting. This expanded role, along with their own limited resources, is creating a position where we need to be able to get them better, more innovative training so that they can do their job safely, the safety issue that's already been brought up. But at the same time, not changing any of the accepted knowledge, skills, and techniques that are used to fight wildland fire. We want to bring them into that mold. it's important for people to understand that action is being taken to help provide those tools, that through the reports and studies that have already been done and the work that is continuing, to be able to better prepare the role and volunteer firefighters to be able to safely protect themselves and the communities that they serve.
Good points all the way around. We're going to share with you some additional places where you can find resources on this topic. And when we come back, Charlie Dickinson will join us again for a final word. Let's look at our resource list. This webcast will be available at www.prepnet10-4webcast.com. Let me give that to you again, www.prepnet10-4webcast.com, and it's going to be available for the next 90 days. So if you go to that site, you'll be able to watch the program again. If you need additional information, let's give you some additional websites. www.nwcg.gov. We've referred to those folks before. They have good information on wildland firefighting. www.usfa.dhs.gov/POCS. www.stateforesters.org. That's State Foresters, FORESTERS.org. And if you'd like to send email questions to us today about our program, you can write us at PrepNet, that's P-R-E-P, all in uppercase, net, lowercase, at dhs.gov. To ask us questions, PrepNet at dhs.gov. Our final word today is Charlie Dickinson, and I think that's appropriate. Charlie, it looks like there's some really good news here, isn't there?
Well, I think so. First of all, the United States Fire Administration thanks the panel members and yourself and the team that put all this together. I think the good news is this is, again, appropriately at the local level. It's where it belongs. I can tell you, 44 years of service that you mentioned that I've had, every incident that I went to was not a national incident, it started locally. However, there are some incidents that require more than just one single fire department, and that's what this is all about. It's about competency, and it's about understanding the responsibility of the interface, which we focused on today, the panel has, rightfully so. That requires some expertise that perhaps a lot of departments many years ago didn't have to have, wasn't required. Kind of like positive pressure ventilation. We didn't have that 20 years ago for the most part, but we've learned to do that. See, the challenge is for fire departments, I believe, is that no fire department that I'm aware of puts up on their marquee, it's the B team on duty today. That we don't have the expertise to handle what we're going to need to stop the fire on your cul-de-sac at the wildland interface, because the rules have changed. The rules today is that we need to not only stop the fire in the forest or the wildland, but we've stopped the fire for where people live and have struggled for a long time to wind up at what they would refer to as utopia. We've accepted that mission because we allow planning and the permission by agencies with jurisdiction for them to live there. So if that's the case, then we need to be the experts to be able to do the very best that we can. So for two things, I think. One, that a fire department, when it arrives, understands what its capabilities are, and certainly understands a lot of the nuances of the wildland fire. When it comes to the dynamics, which is always involved in fire, is time. That's what this is all about, is the ability to understand with the first arriving wave of resources what we're going to be able to accomplish, and what my neighboring departments coming, or I'm going to ask them to do, are they competent to? The panel described it perfectly. It's practice, it's pre-planning, all those terms that we've known in the fire service for years. What am I encouraged about? This isn't an impossible task for the fire service. The fire service always achieves that. It's about individual decisions with the rank of fire chief that's sworn to protect their community. I know that they have concerns about this, and so do we. And the United States Fire Administration, along with a host of other federal and state and local agencies, will help in every way that we can. This isn't about what we can't do. This is about collectively what we can do together to help one another.
Good points. Wildland fires are changing, and wildland fire training is changing. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of our crew here today and the staff who worked on this program for many months, thank you for watching and be safe.